Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm Grant Hamby, and today I'm going to talk about the irrevocable decline of pop music. Well, no, scratch that. We're not going to talk about the decline of pop music today. However, what I would like to talk about is an article on the decline of pop music that was published a few months ago on the website The Intellectual Takeout by John Henchen. The article was published by John Henchen, and it's produced quite a reaction in the music world from many musicians and from many music YouTubers. For example, a musicology PhD student named SF Perez published a scathing parody of Henchel's argument, in which he basically made a somewhat similar argument with respect to 18th century music. And the argument, the lots of people have been, this thing's been floating around for the last couple of months, and in a recent live broadcast, in a live stream, Adam Neely, 8-bit music theory, 12-tone, and Sideways, pretty much savaged Henchel's article as well, calling it not quite out of touch. I didn't use that word, but basically implying that Henchel had no idea what he was talking about. Even questioned whether he was a musician. I don't know whether he's a musician or not. He may have been, he may not have been, who knows. However, with all the outcry, you have to ask the question, well, how much of it is warranted and how much of it is not? In that live stream, which I enjoyed, I thought Adam Neely had the most balanced and most sympathetic approach. I mean, he simply said that the article's problems stem from the fact that Henchel didn't write very well. Well, that's true. It's not a very well written article. I don't think Henchel wrote it nearly as well as he could have, and I think his claims were maybe not as well evidenced as it could have been. However, I think the important thing here is that his argument was not just about pop music, pop music. Certainly that was a major part of it, but it was not simply that. For example, in that same live stream, it was 8-bit? Yeah, it was 8-bit. 8-bit basically, said that the article, and he summed it up in a very, very succinct sentence, that people used to know music, and now no one knows music, and pop music is bad, and science proves it, or science is proof in it, or something like that. Yeah, that's kind of simplistic, and not very well phrased, because that's really not what he's saying. I mean, Henchel does not say pop music is inherently bad, although he does kind of say, though, pop music used to be good and now it's bad. And that's a whole nother argument in and of itself. It's interesting how much response this has gotten, because subsequently Neely published or put out a video in which he talks about, because this came up in the discussion, that a lot of people get stuck on what they enjoy when they're about 14 years old. So we'll say when you're 30 years old, you're still listening to what you were listening to when you're 14 years old. And so whatever 14-year-olds happen to be listening to, whatever's new, you don't necessarily like. It's an interesting argument. I think with respect to pop music, it's true, partially true. I didn't listen to that much pop music when I was 14, so I really can't speak to it. I actually only started listening to pop music that I, enjoyed when I was in my 20s. I grew up hearing it, but then I kind of stopped listening to it in my teens, and then just came back to it in my 20s. So, yeah, I think there is maybe something to that, what he's saying. But that, again, is not really what I want to focus on. I want to focus on the claims that Henchel makes with respect to the importance of music education, and that's its decline. I think one of the key points that Henchel's making is that pop music, or in music in general, is getting bad because we're not putting the investment into the education part of it, and so people are less musically literate than they used to be. I'm not so sure about that claim either, but I do think music education is important, and I do think music education has overall in the Anglophone world declined in the last, let's say since the 70s anyway. And there are reasons for that. So we'll we'll come back. That's really what I'm going to focus on. I'll come back to that in a bit. So there are actually, in Henchel's argument, there are actually 3 claims that are being made. One of which is that pop music is getting worse, and he cites a Spanish study that looked at various aspects of songs, melodic, harmonic, timbral aspects, and basically made the claim that music was getting more simplistic, and hence it's a bad thing. I'm really not sure it's a bad thing. I mean, music in the 1750s became incredibly simplistic after Bach. So anyway, but his other claims are actually important, and there are 2 other claims, and that's what I want to focus on, because no one else seems to really have either focused or cared about the points that he's making here. One is that there is a decline of music education, or the support that music education gets in the public sphere has been in decline, and the other is that there's a decline in student participation in music programs. I think both of those claims there's some empirical data to suggest that that is actually true, at least across the Anglophone world. And the corollary to it is what's implied is that music is sort of being relegated to the private sphere, to mostly those who can afford the instruments, the lessons, and so on, to be able to pursue it. But as a matter of public investment, there's very little public investment. I don't think that's a particularly conservative point of view either. He's one of the criticisms of Henschel is just being a little fogey, he's being just a conservative grump and doesn't like new music. I don't think that's actually quite what's going on here, at least not entirely. So, in my opinion, his claims regarding music education merit serious consideration. Music is one of the most important, I think, one of the most important aspects of being human. It makes life worth living in many cases, or at least gives us the tools with which to deal with the difficulties that life throws at us. So, having said that, within the last, I would say about the last 2 years, the Guardian, which is a British newspaper, very well-known British newspaper, and very leftist and very Marxist, has published a whole series, a plethora of articles on the decline of music education and music participation in UK schools. And I think the similar things can be said not just in the UK, but in the United States, in Australia, and I'll come to Australia in a moment. I think that can be said for the whole Anglophone world. So, for example, in an Australian website newspaper, Dr. Alexander Crook published an article on the decline, or the problems with music education in Australia, particularly in his home state of Victoria. And he argued that there were really two problems. One is that finding teachers who were trained in music, and then the other problem was teachers being given the necessary time allotted to actually teach their students music. I'm not sure that the former problem is a big issue here, but I think the latter problem is definitely an issue here. I've had several conversations in preparation for this. I talked with some friends who teach music in surrounding schools, and the thing that came out pretty consistently is even in the districts in which there was say decent financial funding, which wasn't always the case, but even in those districts, one of the problems was just the simple fact that they never got time with their students. I spoke with one friend who teaches 5th, 6th graders in voice, and he said if he was lucky, he would get an hour or two a month with his students. Well, that's really not enough time to do anything. It's not enough time to really teach music notation. It's not enough time to really develop any kind of musical skills that are necessary for continued growth. So in Crook's article, he noted that in Victoria, that the average time that's devoted to music in the schools is about 1.5% of the entire time students are in school. That seems to correlate very strongly with what my friend Johannes noted in his classroom, and similar similar accounts that I've heard from other teachers in other districts. So I think part of it is just simply the time investment, and then part of it is the monetary investment as well, which is not terribly high either. It could be much higher than it is. So that is an Australian problem, and that's also seems to be a problem here. The Guardian has also noted in several of its other essays decline in the number of students who take, for example, difficult instruments. Difficult instruments being instruments such as French horn, oboe, perhaps violin. One of the problems with bassoon, certainly. Of course, these instruments are, these particular wind instruments are very expensive. They require a great deal of time to learn to master, and you almost certainly have to have some kind of private lessons in order to become proficient on them. So it makes it difficult for students who do want to pursue it because there are huge financial and time barriers to being able to do that. So that was also another issue. I mean, Crook in his began his essay by saying, there are all these school programs and then all these school instruments, and sitting around gathering dust. Well, why is that? Well, part of it is because there's not enough time, and then part of it is that students are so overwhelmed by so many other subjects that they don't have time. So that is a real issue. Okay, related to this issue of students not pursuing instruments, education editor Richard Adams in The Guardian from last year reported that students taking art subjects in general, including music, had dropped significantly over the last 10 years to the point where it is at the lowest it has been in a decade. Now, Adams lays the blame squarely on the government and governmental policy with respect to funding. That could account for why there are fewer students taking very difficult instruments. If there's no money to afford instruments for school districts, well, in general, then there's not going to be a whole lot of money for the acquisition of private instruments. So that could account for that. I think also, and this would relate back to the time issue that Crook talks about, there is in American and probably UK and perhaps Australian schools this extreme push towards more pragmatic topics, math, science, STEM. STEM takes up a lot of time, it's taken up increasing amounts of time. There's also this drive towards standardized testing. The thing about learning a musical instrument or learning how to sing is that, well, you can't make a standardized test for that. I mean, you hear a person play, say, a clarinet, and they play a piece on clarinet. Well, how do you judge it? I mean, a lot of the judgment, well, there's playing in tune, there's playing the correct notes, and on and so forth. But then there's another element to judging a person's musicality, right? Judging their phrasing, judging the dynamics. And some of those things are interpretive matters. It's how you interpret a piece. I'm not saying there's no right and wrong. Clearly there is a right way to play something and a wrong way to play something. But on the other hand, there is a subjective interpretive side to it as well. And so it doesn't fit the mold of educational, the way educational administrators like to administer education, which is by a kind of numbers, metric-based, standardized approach. So what seems to be happening in the music world is that, at least in terms of education, is that there's this drive towards sort of privatization of music. Students who come from more well-to-do families who can afford the musical instruments and the lessons, they get to study an instrument and become proficient in it. Whereas students who come from lesser background, less, let's say, affluent backgrounds, and who live in districts where there's not a lot of funding, but whereas there's this drive towards standardized testing or STEM, have less opportunity to pursue music and to learn about music and to enjoy making music on their own. So I think that is actually a real issue. Now, Henchen does not address this directly. However, it is implied in what he's saying. And reading his article thoughtfully, one, it seems to me, would come to some of these conclusions. I mean, or not. I don't know. I mean, one of the points he makes is that there's a decline in piano sales, a decline in the number of people taking piano. That's true. I mean, there are some figures to back that up. In 2015, The Guardian published an article on this very phenomenon. Now, I think that a lot of people are not buying pianos because, well, pianos are very expensive, and they're fairly high maintenance. I mean, you have to have them tuned regularly. They take up a lot of space. They're very difficult to move, and so they're not user friendly in that respect. Whereas electronic keyboards are easy to move. You don't have to have them tuned necessarily, and they're fairly easily accessible. So I think a lot of people are simply using electronic keyboards these days, which that's fine. You do if you really want to learn how to do music, you do what you have to, and get what resources that you can afford and are available to you. That's okay. However, it does, my personal experience has been that, and I have an electronic keyboard. I don't really have a piano myself. But my experience has been that learning to play on the piano, there is a different feel to it, and so it really helps your keyboard skills in general if you learn to play on piano. So, to some of the points I've already made, Charlotte Gill wrote an op-ed in The Guardian in March 2017. In her article, she discusses the consequences of privatizing music in the way that it's being privatized. The fact is that access to learning about music becomes the preserve of only those who can afford it. The private tutors, the lessons, the instruments. And the other problem that I see with this is that people end up having music education as kind of a check-off for getting into the school of your choice. In other words, music is not pursued as something valuable in itself. It's pursued as simply a means to another end, just another feather in the cap of becoming a physician or a lawyer. And that's really an unfortunate thing, I think. I think it's an unfortunate thing because music is actually extremely vital to human well-being. So, what does one do with that? That's a really good question. So one of Gill's points is that music in the UK was taught in a fairly academic fashion, should be less so. I don't think that's much of a problem in the United States, as it is a UK problem. I think, and I'm not entirely sure what she means by an academic approach. Does she mean that theory shouldn't be taught? I'm not so sure that would be a good idea, but regardless, I think she's talking about something that's more UK issue than an American issue. So my proposal would be the same as that of Stephen Moss, who in June 2017 wrote an article in The Guardian, or an op-ed in The Guardian, basically arguing, well, why not put music at the heart of education? Well, why not indeed? Yes, it's a very utopian idea, I realize that, but the idea of giving every child who wishes to the opportunity to learn to sing, to play at an instrument, to learn music in general, I think would carry with it enormous social, emotional, and health benefits, and intellectual benefits as well. There have been just a plethora, a huge number of studies in the last 10 years documenting the incredible effects psychologically, emotionally, intellectually, that not just hearing music, but performing music, playing music, has on the development of, especially when you're younger, development of young people. People who pursue music, especially learn to play an instrument or sing, tend to be healthier, more stable, and definitely, just for lack of a better term, smarter. So, given the amount of empirical evidence, one has to ask the question: why isn't music at the heart of the education system? Why wouldn't it be? For hundreds of years, music has been at the heart of an education. If you look at the old way of thinking about the liberal arts, you had the trivium, which was logic and grammar and rhetoric, and then you had the quadrivium, which was more what we consider today to be sciences. It was maths, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy, and last but not least, music. Music was at the heart of the curriculum. I think music actually does go a long way towards bridging the gap between the liberal arts or the humanities and the sciences, because music is in one sense, a highly technical, symbolic system, and on the other hand, it does connect with science in the field of acoustics, in the side of biology, how it affects our hearing, and psychology, and then the humanities in general, especially when you start playing text. I mean, music is it's a central part of the human experience. So making it a central part of the education system makes a whole lot of sense. Plato would certainly like this idea, I think. Now, granted, there are people who are not responsive to music. I mean, Oliver Sacks in his book, Musicophilia, referred to as people with amusia, and they're people who are only mildly affected by music, and who may not want to pursue it at all. I'm not arguing everybody must pursue music. What I am arguing is that those who wish to pursue it beyond a certain level of exposure ought to be given every opportunity to do so. And I still think it should be a central part of the curriculum for that very reason. For many of us, music shapes our lives in manifold ways and has done much to make our lives far richer than they would have otherwise been. So it is something that I think our societies could, at the very least, give to the people as a gift. That's something I wouldn't mind talking about at some point, actually, the importance of gift giving. So, but there it is. I think Henchel's central claim is that music education has been in decline in terms of both of the amount of money, the amount of public investment, and the number of students participating. And I think it is probably the case that he definitely has a point. This has been published, numerous articles have been published in numerous newspapers, journals, magazines that bear this out. Now, he could have perhaps researched a little better, I agree, but I think this claim is really the claim that people should have been looking at, rather than the issue over pop music, which I'm not going to say it's a non-issue, but I think people just got very offended that he said that and didn't look at the other side of the coin, as it were. So we can save pop music for a later day. I don't even want to think about wading into that deep pool anytime soon. There are some undertows there I greatly fear. So, but thank you. Thank you for watching. I appreciate you taking the time to hear what I have to say on this, and go read these articles. I think you'll find them very interesting, and I like to hear what you think. Do you think that how could we find ways to put music at the center of the curriculum? I think that's a really good question. What positive strategies could we do to create more public investment into music, and also to provide more time for teachers to actually be able to work with their students, so that especially those gifted students can be given more opportunities. So those are good questions, and I would like to hear your responses on that. So thanks for watching. I appreciate the time you spent, and please like and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.